When you imagine the Middle Ages, you probably picture monasteries echoing with prayer, armored knights marching to battle, and pious villagers living lives of purity and devotion. You might think sexuality was suppressed, hidden away, and strictly controlled by religion. But the truth is far darker. Because medieval sexuality wasn't just alive, it was disturbingly unhinged. Beneath the surface of church sermons and royal pageantry lay practices so unsettling, so grotesque, and so shockingly bizarre that they make even today's scandals look tame. These were customs born from a toxic mixture of superstition, religion, and desperation, and they reveal a world where intimacy became a weapon, a performance, and sometimes a nightmare. Tonight, you will discover the most disturbing sexual practices of the Middle Ages, a journey into the hidden chambers of history that will forever shatter your idea of what purity in the medieval world truly meant. When we peel back the veil of medieval life and look closely at the ways young men and women were introduced to one another, we find not the soft images of courtly romance that ballads sing about, but a bizarre and deeply unsettling practice that reveals how the Middle Ages turned even love into an experiment in restraint, control, and contradiction. This practice, known as bundling, was not some isolated rural superstition but a widely recognized custom across much of Europe, particularly in the colder northern regions where it became not just tolerated but institutionalized. Imagine yourself as a young man, perhaps no more than 16, whose parents have decided it is time to meet a potential spouse. Rather than being left to walk in gardens, speak by the fireside, or learn about each other through conversation, you are led to a chamber where your fate is sealed in the most awkward fashion imaginable. A bed is prepared, a thick sack or specially stitched cloth is brought out, and you and this stranger, this possible partner for life, are placed together within it. Sometimes, to make the ritual more binding, a solid plank of wood was laid between the two bodies, so that while you might feel the warmth of another presence beside you, actual physical intimacy was strictly forbidden. It was, in effect, a form of supervised temptation, a trial designed to test desire and restraint while under the watchful approval of the family itself. The very existence of bundling exposes the twisted medieval attitude toward sexuality, one that feared it as dangerous yet could not help but orchestrate situations in which it was provoked. Families encouraged their daughters and sons to lie together through the night under the same blankets, fully clothed, wrapped tightly so that neither could move freely, as if the body's natural instincts could be bound by linen and wood. The absurdity of this system becomes even clearer when we realize that an entire small industry developed around it. Special bundling bags were produced and sold, with designs that allowed two people to share a bed while being sewn in or tied off to prevent accidents. Parents saw this as a safe and practical way for couples to bond without sin, but records from the period reveal what we already know instinctively, that such close proximity almost always led to outcomes the system was meant to prevent. Pregnancy rates among bundling couples were remarkably high, and rather than being an effective method of maintaining chastity, bundling became notorious as a pathway into exactly the situations the church and families feared most. What makes this practice even more disturbing is the way it combined intimacy with surveillance. Young couples were never truly alone in their experience, because the very act of bundling was carried out under the authority of parents or guardians who sanctioned it. A girl's virtue was supposed to be safeguarded, yet she was expected to endure the strange ordeal of being physically confined with a stranger, sometimes for multiple nights. The church itself railed against this custom, condemning it as immoral and dangerous, but its popularity made it almost impossible to eradicate. Priests preached against it, comparing it to a direct invitation to fornication, but families clung to it as if it were a time-honored tradition that made marriages more secure. It became a kind of cultural tug-of-war, with religious authorities urging reform while rural communities dismissed their warnings, treating bundling as normal, even necessary, in the path to marriage. There is something profoundly unsettling about the psychology behind this practice. In bundling, we see how medieval society turned human desire into a theatrical performance of contradictions, forcing two young bodies into closeness while pretending to deny them contact, demanding obedience to rules that were almost designed to be broken, and then expressing shock when those rules inevitably failed. This constant double standard between desire and denial reveals how distorted sexuality had become under the weight of superstition, religion, and cultural ritual. A bundling night was never simply about two young people meeting each other. It was about the community projecting its anxieties onto them, about using their bodies as a battleground for moral struggles that no plank of wood could ever contain. Even more disturbing is how bundling blurred the lines between consent and coercion. In many cases, the young girl had little choice in whether she participated, because her family believed it necessary for marital negotiations. A father or mother could command their daughter to spend the night bundled with a suitor, and refusal would be seen as shameful or disobedient. What might have been presented as a quaint ritual of introduction was, in reality, a deeply invasive act, one that stripped away agency from the very people whose future was supposedly being secured. The forced nearness, the suppression of freedom, the illusion of safety, and the very expectation that two youths could be judged fit for marriage on the basis of such a night. All of this illustrates how disturbing medieval approaches to sexuality could be. When historians describe bundling, there is often an undertone of irony, a recognition that such customs seem absurd to the modern reader. But when we look closely at the lived reality of the young people forced into it, we see less of the comic and more of the tragic. It was not just a curious relic of folklore. It was an institutionalized ritual that revealed how distorted ideas of morality and purity could produce systems that were psychologically damaging, humiliating, and physically dangerous. It stands as a symbol of how the Middle Ages attempted to regulate intimacy through bizarre and contradictory practices, ones that told young people they must both embrace and resist each other, that turned their most personal experiences into public spectacles of control. And as we begin to uncover the many other disturbing sexual customs of the Middle Ages, bundling serves as the perfect entry point, a reminder that behind every quaint tradition was often a much darker truth. If bundling revealed how medieval society tried to regulate desire through restraint, then the world of food and feasting reveals how that same society also indulged desire in ways so disturbing that they challenge our very idea of what it means to eat, to celebrate, and to prepare the body for intimacy. In the Middle Ages, the dining table was not simply a place for nourishment. It was a stage for rituals of fertility, passion, and sexual stimulation that combined superstition, medicine, and appetite into a grotesque mixture of indulgence and belief. To step into the halls of a medieval wedding or banquet was to witness a performance in which every dish, every spice, every ingredient carried not just taste but symbolic and erotic weight. Food became an extension of the bedroom, a preparation for acts that were believed to require supernatural aid. And in this belief, medieval people turned to ingredients that, by our standards, appear not only bizarre but profoundly disturbing. The centerpiece of these aphrodisiac feasts was the use of animal reproductive organs, most notably testicles, which were consumed in astonishing variety. Bulls, rams, and boars were slaughtered not only for their meat, but specifically for their organs, which were believed to contain the very essence of virility. Medieval cookbooks, preserved in monasteries and noble households, contain recipes that describe the preparation of these organs with the same seriousness that modern medical texts describe the prescription of medicine. Testicles, often referred to delicately as stones, were roasted, boiled, fried, ground into powder, or infused into wine, each method promising to transfer strength, potency, and sexual energy to the consumer. The logic was that fertility could be consumed, that the essence of procreation within the body of an animal could be harnessed through the act of eating, and that through this act, humans could borrow nature's power for their own pleasure. There is something profoundly unsettling in this idea of devouring another creature's sexuality in order to enhance one's own, and it speaks to a worldview in which the boundaries between life, death, reproduction, and appetite were disturbingly blurred. Yet testicles were only the beginning of this strange cuisine. Other recipes called for sparrow brains, consumed because sparrows were associated with passion and unrestrained mating. By eating the brains of such birds, people believed they could absorb the animal's endless energy for reproduction. This form of sympathetic magic was common throughout medieval thought, the idea that by consuming a part of a creature one could take on its qualities, and nowhere did it manifest more grotesquely than in the kitchens of aphrodisiac feasts. Dishes of animal wombs, hearts, and kidneys were served with confidence that they would awaken desire, and the logic extended even into the realm of plants and spices. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron, all brought at great expense from faraway lands, were not only used to enhance flavor but were believed to spark the fires of lust. The high price of these spices was justified not just by their rarity, but by the promise that they carried the power to make a man more vigorous or a woman more receptive, transforming the dining table into a kind of alchemical ritual for sex. The disturbing element here is not simply that people ate unusual foods, but that entire ceremonies were constructed around these beliefs. Wealthy nobles would host elaborate banquets at which every course, from the starter to the dessert, was chosen for its supposed ability to stimulate desire. At weddings, these aphrodisiac meals were especially emphasized, with dishes deliberately designed to ensure that the bride and groom would not only consummate their marriage but do so with passion and success. Imagine sitting at a wedding feast where instead of cake and wine you are served platters of animal genitals, roasted bird brains, and spiced dishes meant to drive you toward lust. Guests would participate in this performance as if it were completely natural, as though the entire community's responsibility was to ensure that the newlyweds' union produced not only intimacy, but children. In this way, sex became a public concern, reinforced through communal eating, where the line between celebration and intrusion was all but erased. The medical establishment of the Middle Ages did nothing to resist these practices. In fact, it legitimized them. Physicians of the time wrote detailed treatises on the preparation of aphrodisiac foods, often with titles that linked directly to the generation of semen or the increase of lust. These were not whispered secrets or underground practices. They were codified in manuscripts studied by scholars and preserved in libraries. Doctors believed that sexual health was deeply tied to diet, and that foods could alter the humors of the body in ways that promoted fertility. Thus, the grotesque menus of aphrodisiac feasts were not viewed as scandalous or indulgent, but as practical and even necessary. This institutional approval made the feasts all the more disturbing, because it meant that entire systems of knowledge and authority were devoted to reinforcing the idea that sexuality could be manipulated, amplified, and directed through bizarre culinary rituals. Religious authorities, meanwhile, found themselves once again in conflict with the customs of the people. Certain foods were actually banned during fasting seasons, not because they were rich or indulgent, but because they were considered too stimulating. To eat saffron or almonds during Lent was not only a violation of dietary restrictions, but a threat to spiritual purity, because these foods were thought to inflame lust at a time when the soul was supposed to be focused on God. This prohibition reveals the deep fear that even the simplest act of eating could unleash desires too powerful to contain, and that without constant regulation, the body might betray the soul. Yet despite these restrictions, aphrodisiac feasts continued, and often the very clergy who condemned them were found participating in them, their hypocrisy only adding another layer of darkness to the picture. The legacy of these feasts is one of profound contradiction. On the one hand, they reveal how desperately medieval society tried to control sexuality, channeling it into the structures of marriage and reproduction. On the other hand, they expose how sexuality was constantly celebrated, provoked, and even worshipped through rituals of eating and drinking that transformed food into a kind of erotic sacrament. To sit at such a table was to become part of a disturbing performance in which every bite was meant to inflame the body, every dish a symbolic preparation for acts that would be carried out later in the bedchamber. The medieval obsession with sexual foods shows us that, beneath the surface of purity and chastity, there lay a society fascinated by lust, unashamed to turn even the act of nourishment into a disturbing ritual of desire. If the practice of bundling distorted courtship and the feasts of aphrodisiacs transformed the dining table into a grotesque prelude to intimacy, then the medieval custom of bedding ceremonies takes us further into a world where privacy was not simply neglected, but deliberately destroyed. To modern minds, the idea of intimacy is deeply tied to secrecy, to the sacred privacy of two people alone together. But in the Middle Ages, particularly among noble families, consummation was not a private act, but a public responsibility, an event to be monitored, documented, and witnessed in order to secure legal, political, and social obligations. The very foundation of a marriage contract depended not on vows alone, but on proof of sexual union. And so medieval society devised one of the most disturbing rituals imaginable, the witnessed bedding ceremony. After the conclusion of the wedding festivities, when the bride and groom might hope for a moment of relief from the public gaze, Their ordeal was only just beginning. In a procession that seems more like a ritual sacrifice than a romantic farewell, the couple was escorted to their chamber by a host of family members, nobles, priests, and sometimes even court officials. The bride would be stripped of her garments by female relatives, while the groom was undressed by his male kin, as if the very act of disrobing had to be divided along gendered lines of authority. Once undressed, they were placed in the bed not as lovers beginning their union, but as performers about to carry out an act under surveillance. The room remained full, with witnesses gathered around to ensure that the marriage was made real. Privacy was considered not only unnecessary but dangerous, because without witnesses there could be no proof, and without proof, the legitimacy of heirs and the security of alliances could always be contested. The level of detail with which these ceremonies were conducted is chilling. Witnesses did not simply observe the couple entering the bedchamber and then retreat. In many cases, they remained present throughout the act itself. They offered commentary, encouragement, even instructions, as if intimacy were a performance to be guided by onlookers. Nobles leaned close to verify what was happening, and clerics prayed aloud to bless the act, turning the most personal and vulnerable human experience into something grotesquely theatrical. In some instances, bedsheets were examined afterward, checked for blood as proof of the bride's virginity, or for physical evidence that consummation had taken place. The marriage bed became a courtroom, the sheets evidence, the act itself, a trial in which failure could annul a union, strip a family of property, and unravel entire political alliances. This custom reveals not only the lack of privacy, but also the dehumanizing nature of medieval sexuality. The bride and groom were stripped of agency, forced into a ritual that turned their bodies into symbols of property, alliance, and inheritance. For women, the pressure was even more unbearable, for their value was often reduced to their ability to prove chastity in that moment. If no blood appeared on the sheets, whispers of scandal could spread instantly, with accusations of dishonor that could ruin not only the bride but her entire family. Men, too, carried the weight of expectation, for failure to perform was not just a personal humiliation but a legal disaster. Records survive of marriages annulled because consummation could not be proven, leading to repeated demands that the act be attempted again, sometimes multiple times, until witnesses were satisfied. Imagine the psychological torment of having to perform your most intimate act not once but under repeated supervision, with the entire weight of dynastic politics pressing down on your body. Even more disturbing is the normalization of this practice. Etiquette manuals of the time included instructions on how witnesses should behave, where they should stand, what they should say, and even how long they should remain. This was not an occasional intrusion, but an institutionalized system embedded into the culture of aristocratic marriage. Couples were not granted the dignity of privacy because their union was not considered a personal bond, but a public contract, one in which the community had a stake and thus a right to observe. In this way, sexuality was stripped of intimacy and transformed into a matter of governance, with bodies serving as legal instruments rather than as human beings capable of tenderness and vulnerability. The cruelty of the bedding ceremony lies not only in its voyeurism, but in its relentless reduction of sex to transaction. What should have been an act of mutual discovery became instead an ordeal of surveillance, a trial of performance, a humiliation wrapped in the guise of duty. It reveals how deeply entangled power, property, and sexuality were in the Middle Ages, and how little space was left for individual dignity. To be married in such a system was not to find companionship but to enter into a binding contract, one that demanded proof of fertility and desire on command, in the presence of others, as if the body itself were nothing more than a legal signature. When we think of romance in the medieval world, we often recall the songs of troubadours and the ideals of chivalry. Yet beneath those poetic images lay this disturbing reality, a society that turned love into evidence, intimacy into spectacle, and human vulnerability into a stage for power. The bedding ceremony stands as one of the clearest examples of how the Middle Ages corrupted sexuality, stripping it of privacy, love, and tenderness, and replacing it with duty, surveillance, and public scrutiny. For the bride and groom, their union was not theirs alone, but a matter of law, property, and politics. In this sense, the medieval bedchamber was not a place of rest but a courtroom, not a sanctuary but a stage, not a private refuge but a prison of expectation. And from this practice, we can see clearly why the sexual customs of the Middle Ages remain among the most disturbing in human history. If bedding ceremonies revealed the disturbing destruction of privacy in aristocratic marriage, then the medieval practice of impotence trials exposes a world where the law, religion, and society combined to pry open the most intimate corners of human life, stripping away not just dignity, but basic humanity. In a society where divorce was almost impossible because marriage was considered a sacrament, one of the very few legal loopholes available to a woman trapped in an unhappy union was to accuse her husband of impotence. What followed was a process so grotesque and humiliating that it shocks the modern mind. The courtroom became a bedroom, judges became voyeurs, and sex itself was transformed into legal evidence. The procedure was terrifying in its detail. Once an accusation of impotence was made, the man and woman were subjected to thorough examinations by physicians appointed by the court. These physicians were tasked with evaluating the genitals of both spouses, searching for physical abnormalities, signs of disease, or anything that could suggest incapacity. The process was invasive, public, and deeply shaming, but it was only the beginning. If no conclusive medical judgment could be reached, the court could order what was known as the trial by Congress, a supervised sexual act designed to determine whether or not the husband was truly capable of consummation. Special chambers were prepared for this ordeal, sometimes within the courthouse itself, other times in lodgings rented specifically for the occasion. The husband and wife were expected to perform intercourse under the watch of physicians, clerics, and legal officials, who would either observe directly or peep through holes and screens to verify whether the act had been successful. Nothing could be more degrading than to have one's most personal struggle turned into a performance for strangers with pens and ink, ready to record the outcome. The trial by Congress was not a single ordeal, but often a repeated one. If the husband failed once, he could be given multiple chances, sometimes over weeks or even months, to prove his virility. The humiliation was relentless, with each failure leading to further gossip and ridicule, not only in the courtroom but throughout the community. Neighbors whispered, servants laughed, and rivals used the accusations to undermine reputations. Men sometimes attempted to cheat the system, smuggling aphrodisiac potions, herbs, or charms into the chamber, but even these attempts at deception often backfired, with officials catching them in the act and exposing their desperation as further evidence of incapacity. For the wives, the ordeal was equally cruel, as they were required to prove their willingness and receptivity, often questioned about their own responses and examined for signs of arousal, as if their bodies too were on trial. What should have been a private tragedy between two individuals became a public spectacle, a grotesque parody of justice in which the only certainty was the destruction of dignity. The consequences of impotence trials were devastating. A man found incapable could lose not only his marriage but his honor, his reputation, and his social standing. Women who accused their husbands risked being branded liars if the trial concluded against them, and the stigma of having participated in such humiliating proceedings often followed them for life. The very act of bringing an accusation exposed both spouses to a form of public shaming from which there was little escape. In this way, the church and courts created a legal mechanism that did not simply resolve disputes, but exploited human vulnerability, turning suffering into entertainment for society and ensuring that sexuality remained bound by chains of fear, surveillance, and shame. Yet impotence trials were not the only way in which the church entangled itself with sexuality in disturbing ways. Even more shocking is the historical reality that the same institution which condemned lust from the pulpit and demanded purity from its flock also oversaw and profited from prostitution on a massive scale. In cities like London, brothels were not hidden dens of sin tucked away in dark alleys. They were licensed, regulated, and often owned by the church itself. Bishops collected rents from brothel keepers, clerics enforced dress codes on prostitutes, and the revenues flowed upward into the very institutions that thundered against fornication every Sunday. This grotesque hypocrisy reveals a society in which morality was not an absolute principle, but a commodity, traded and exploited by the same powers that claimed to guard souls from damnation. The church justified its involvement by arguing that prostitution was a necessary evil that prevented greater sins like adultery or sodomy. In practice, this meant that priests and bishops, men sworn to celibacy and purity, became landlords of sexual commerce, ensuring that brothels operated smoothly and profitably. Prostitutes were subjected to strict rules. They could not work on holy days. They were required to live in designated districts, and they often had to wear distinctive clothing that marked them as members of their trade. Far from offering protection, these regulations kept them marginalized, exploited, and easily controlled, while ensuring a steady stream of income for church coffers. The money earned from these arrangements was not hidden. It was used to fund the construction of churches, the maintenance of monasteries, and the celebration of religious festivals. In one of the most disturbing paradoxes of the Middle Ages, sin quite literally paid for salvation. This system was not small or temporary, but endured for centuries. Attempts by reformers to dismantle church-owned prostitution networks were met with resistance, not only from the clergy but also from secular authorities who benefited from the revenues. The trade was so entrenched that its collapse only came with the upheavals of the Reformation, when the exposure of such glaring hypocrisy became impossible to ignore. For hundreds of years, however, the medieval world accepted as normal the fact that the guardians of purity were also the masters of vice, blurring the boundaries between sanctity and exploitation until the two were indistinguishable. Taken together, impotence trials and the Church's brothel empire reveal a society in which sexuality was never truly private, never truly personal, and never free from control. The law and religion combined to seize even the most intimate moments of human life, transforming them into evidence, profit, and public performance. Whether in the courtroom chamber where a man was forced to prove his virility before strangers, or in the bustling streets where prostitutes paid rent to bishops, the body was always subject to inspection, exploitation, and control. What emerges from this picture is not a world of innocence or piety, but a world of hypocrisy, cruelty, and distortion, where the very institutions that claimed to save the soul profited from the degradation of the flesh. If the impotence trials exposed the cruelty of public humiliation and the Church's brothel trade revealed the hypocrisy of religious authority, then the realm of medieval birth control and fertility rituals drags us into a world where desperation, superstition, and sheer ignorance collided to produce practices so disturbing and dangerous that they make the other customs of the age seem almost tame. For in a society obsessed with controlling desire, ensuring heirs, and protecting purity, the body itself became a battlefield of charms, poisons, talismans, and bizarre contraptions, where men and women risked their health, their dignity, and even their lives in pursuit of either preventing or ensuring conception. The ingenuity of these methods is undeniable, but so too is their grotesque absurdity, for they reveal how little was truly understood about reproduction and how far people were willing to go when driven by fear and necessity. One of the most disturbing categories of medieval birth control involved the use of animal parts, especially the ever-present symbol of virility in this period: testicles. Women were instructed to wear amulets containing weasel testicles around their necks, the belief being that since weasels were considered highly sexual animals, yet bore only small litters, their reproductive organs carried the magical property of limited fertility. Other recipes called for the grinding of beaver testicles into powder, which was then mixed with wine and consumed as a potion meant to prevent conception. This grotesque fascination with animal genitals reflected a worldview in which the boundaries between species were ignored, as if by wearing or consuming parts of another creature, one could manipulate the mysteries of human reproduction. The disturbing irony, of course, is that these practices not only failed to provide reliable birth control, but often inflicted harm on those desperate enough to try them. Equally alarming were the potions and concoctions that women drank in the hope of preventing pregnancy. Recipes included substances like powdered iron, ground gemstones, and, most shockingly, mercury, a poisonous metal whose toxic effects were not understood but whose strange shimmer led people to believe it carried mystical properties. Women poisoned themselves slowly in their efforts to avoid unwanted children, and while death did indeed prevent pregnancy, it revealed the terrifying ignorance with which the medieval world treated the female body. Some formulas called for plants and herbs, many of which could induce miscarriages, but at the cost of intense suffering, internal damage, and even permanent sterility. In the desperation to control fertility, countless women became casualties of superstition disguised as medicine. their suffering a silent testimony to a society that reduced their health to a secondary concern beneath the demand for heirs. The mechanical and physical methods of birth control were no less bizarre. Women were advised to insert substances directly into their bodies before intercourse in order to block or destroy semen. Among the recommendations were wool soaked in honey, pastes made of various herbs, and, astonishingly, crocodile dung imported from distant lands, believed to form an effective barrier against conception. Some women used halves of lemons as primitive cervical caps, the citric acid offering some slight effectiveness, but at the cost of extreme discomfort. These makeshift barriers reveal both the creativity and the desperation of medieval people, for in the absence of scientific understanding, they relied on whatever substances could be imagined to act as shields, no matter how unhygienic, painful, or absurd. The idea that fertility could be prevented through sneezing also gained popularity, with physicians instructing women to induce sneezes immediately after intercourse using pepper or irritants, the belief being that the force of the sneeze could expel semen from the body. Such recommendations illustrate the profound ignorance of female anatomy and reproduction, where fantasy and superstition masqueraded as medical advice. Beyond birth control, the medieval obsession with fertility spawned an entire culture of magical underwear, amulets, and charms. One of the most famous items was the so-called Girdle of Venus, a belt worn around the hips or waist and inscribed with prayers, astrological symbols, or incantations designed to ensure conception, protect against miscarriage, or enhance sexual performance. These belts were often made of expensive materials such as silk or linen, and the wealthiest families adorned them with gold thread or gemstones. Women clung to these objects as though they were lifelines, convinced that without them pregnancy would not be possible. Conception stones, small crystals or rocks inserted into clothing or worn close to the body during intercourse, were also popular, with different stones supposedly producing different results: emeralds for boys, sapphires for girls, and diamonds for twins. The idea that the gender of a child could be determined by the type of stone a woman carried reveals a profound desire to exert control over fate, even at the cost of reason. Men, too, were drawn into this world of magical sexuality. Amulets containing animal parts, blessed rings worn on certain fingers, and specially consecrated loincloths were believed to enhance virility and ensure success in bed. Priests themselves participated by blessing these items, turning the church into a kind of subscription service for fertility, charging fees for prayers and rituals intended to sanctify the instruments of sex. In some cases, bed sheets were blessed, talismans were sewn into undergarments, and couples were given elaborate instructions on how to wear and use their accessories, complete with prayers to recite and rituals to follow if the charms seemed to fail. Manuals survive describing these processes with astonishing seriousness, offering step-by-step directions that transformed intimate acts into liturgical performances, blending desire with ritual in ways that seem profoundly unsettling today. When we step back from these practices, what emerges is not just a catalogue of strange customs, but a disturbing portrait of a society in which sexuality was never left to nature, affection, or love. It was instead treated as a problem to be managed, a battlefield of fear and superstition where every act of intimacy carried the weight of cosmic, medical, or spiritual consequence. Women bore the brunt of this burden, their bodies subjected to poisons, charms, and humiliating tests, while men were no less entangled in the absurdity of being judged, measured, and bound by rituals of virility. What we see is a culture both fascinated and terrified by sex, one that built elaborate systems of control that deformed the very meaning of intimacy. The most disturbing truth of all is that behind every ritual, every charm, every trial, there were human lives caught in the middle, young brides forced into bundling sacks, grooms humiliated before witnesses, women poisoned by false remedies, men paraded through courts as objects of ridicule, and communities whose morality was built upon contradictions so glaring they seem almost surreal. To study these practices is not to laugh at medieval ignorance, but to confront the reality of a world where sexuality was corrupted by fear, power, and superstition. The Middle Ages were not dark because people denied sex, they were dark because of what they did with it. And as we close this disturbing chapter of history, remember that uncovering these hidden truths is not just an act of curiosity, but an act of recognition, for the shadows of control, hypocrisy, and exploitation have not vanished entirely from the world. So if you believe history should never hide its darkest secrets, if you value the uncovering of these truths, no matter how unsettling they may be, then support this work. Like this video, share it so others may confront the forgotten realities of the past, and subscribe to this channel to join a community committed to shining light on the shadows of history. Only by remembering can we resist repetition, and only by acknowledging what once was can we hope to build a future where no society ever dares again to turn the most intimate parts of human life into instruments of control.